Trump reframes NATO and Europe in transactional terms. How does that affect United States strategies in the Middle East?
Well, let me just, first of all, just follow up on what the ambassador said. Although I agree that Trump is, of course, a showman and he's interested in headlines and he sometimes doesn't follow up on things. For example, he removed Maduro in Venezuela and then he switched to the topic of Greenland without following up, or he threatened to hit the Iranian regime and so far he hasn't followed up. At the same time, I think we're being a bit unfair. I think Trump is actually pretty serious about thinking outside the box on most major international issues, including the Middle East, Greenland, Iran, NATO, South America, and so on. And I think that, in a way, the Europeans and the existing diplomatic order in the United Nations are too much looking at the last war. Trump is some steps ahead, looking at what might happen in future. Before I come to the Middle East, if I could just quickly say about Greenland, he's looking at the threats that might come from missiles and such from the north, whereas the Europeans are still looking at Russian tanks coming into Poland from the east. And we shouldn't dismiss Trump too easily. So going to the Middle East, he did get the Abraham Accords, 4 peace deals with Israel and 4 Arab countries in his first term. His Gaza Board of Peace, which is going to be signed into existence tomorrow morning at Davos. He's invited a whole number of countries. It's not quite clear yet which countries are ready to accept to join this Board of Peace. It seems on the face of it a bit muddled, but what I've learned is if you strip away Trump's language and his sometimes insulting language to other world leaders or to President Biden or even other American politicians, there is some strategic thought there. And I think he does have some play that he's proposing for Gaza, yes.
2 decades, Gaza diplomacy was driven by bilateral deals, humanitarian corridors, and short-term crisis intervention. Is this initiative the first attempt to move toward a structured multilateral framework?
Well, the main problem for Gaza in the last 2 decades was that it was run by Hamas, who seized power from Fatah, executed, that's the rival Palestinian faction, and spent a great deal of their resources and energy building up arsenals of rockets to fire at Israel, or building up a quite impressive, from a structural point of view, underground tunnel network. And what you need for Gaza to move forward is for Hamas to no longer rule Gaza, and to have a governing authority there that is interested in building up a successful entity that wants to enjoy peaceful relations with its Israeli neighbor, not one that wants to fight perpetual jihad. So the Trump peace plan, the ceasefire that was announced last year, the first stage of, I think it's 18-point plan, was that Hamas would disarm. As of now, Hamas have not disarmed, quite the contrary. They've actually been executing political opponents and so on, and they've been rearming with guns and guns and other weapons smuggled in by drone from Egypt and through some existing tunnels. So there are reports in the Saudi media that some senior Hamas leaders from Gaza have agreed to now leave the Gaza Strip and go and live elsewhere, presumably Qatar or maybe Turkey. But that remains to be seen. As long as Hamas are in control on the ground, even if Gaza is rebuilt, that won't necessarily lead to peace. You have to have governments in Gaza and indeed in Israel that want to have peace. And no amount of goodwill or wishful desire by Trump or anyone else in the international community is going to make peace if you don't have a government in Gaza that wants peace.
In continuation of this topic, Baku's reconstruction of Karabakh emphasized connectivity, smart cities, and logistics. Can the model be transferred to Gaza, or would Gaza require a different paradigm?
Well, just following up what the ambassador said, of course, economic prosperity is crucial for peace and good relations. However, in the case of Gaza, the economic investment is the least of worries. I mean, for example, Qatar, which has been very involved with Gaza, spent about as much on the last World Cup, the last Football World Cup, as would cost to rebuild the whole of Gaza. Gaza's population is only about 2 million. The problem in Gaza is political Islam, is jihad. It's not economics. There was, in fact, a fairly good life in Gaza, despite lots of the Western media depiction of it before the recent war. There were shopping malls. A friend of mine from the Financial Times said that he stayed in the nicest hotel in the Middle East he'd stayed in was in Gaza, not in Dubai. So it's not about money. Money is available quite easily in the Middle East from countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. The problem is you have to have a government in Gaza that does care about the well-being of its own children. And I would argue that Hamas doesn't. In fact, it's quite happy to sacrifice them in the name of a kind of Islamic jihad. And the ideological problem there is the biggest problem, not an economic problem.
Mr. Gross, one more question to you. Is it possible to separate reconstruction from governance, or will rebuilding inevitably produce new political actors and institutions in Gaza?
No, rebuilding by itself won't produce anything. To remind your viewers, there have been smaller wars between Hamas and Israel, about 4 of them in 2009, 2012, 2018, 2021. There was reconstruction after all those wars, and that didn't lead to peace. Why? Because Hamas was just building up an ever greater arsenal of hundreds of thousands of rockets and other weapons to try and kill Israeli civilians and invade Israel. So obviously you also need a government in Israel that wants peace, but I think the majority of Israelis would welcome peaceful and good relations with Palestinians in Gaza. But Hamas, it's not in their DNA to do state building. And look, it is possible for Islamists to change. It's quite possible that the new leader of Syria, President Shara, previously a militant Islamist, is going to emerge as a respectable statesman interested in state building. But the jury's out in Syria, and at least al-Shara's made indications and convinced people like President Trump that he wants to be a serious leader. Hamas are not even pretending to want to be serious statesman-like state-building governing force. They immediately after the ceasefire went about summarily executing political opponents in a very public way to show Gazans who's boss, and again siphoning off aid and money and so on. They're a corrupt and jihadi-like organization. So you can reconstruct buildings, but they won't lead to peace without a government that wants peace.
Can the United States pressure Europe economically and still expect alignment on security and reconstruction issues?
Well, I think, look, Donald Trump's a very unusual figure, and he can be very bombastic and rude. But I think when you look at his actual worldview, he's quite forward-looking, and he's right about a lot of issues. And it's Europe that's sort of stuck in the past. I mean, why should America pay for everything without getting more control? Who is going to defend Europe without the US? Who is going to defend Greenland without the US? Who's going to defend Middle Eastern states, which is why Middle Eastern allies of America, like the UAE and the Saudis, they understand the need to be grateful and cooperate and help pay for American defense and support. And I think Europeans should understand that too. Europe's a rich continent. It's numerically bigger than the US. And I think, Trump's got a point when he says, if you're not going to put money into it, why should we do things? I also think that Europe is slightly stuck in the past. It's playing by rules of international law which it makes up. So it will criticize, for example, Trump for grabbing Maduro with Venezuela. But at the same time, it said they've made up international laws to arrest the American ally, the Prime Minister of Israel, were he to set foot in France or Britain. So Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot presently set foot in countries like Britain or France. And America is saying, you have to back us. If you want help with your defense, you better come on board generally with an, an America first point of view, or American leadership point of view. And I think, I think it's about a dialogue with Europe, but I think he's shaking things up, and it's necessary to shake things up. And Europe shouldn't just go off in a huff or be insulted by Trump's, very strong language sometimes. They should engage him and think outside the box about a future world where China and Russia and others are the real threat, and they have to get on board with it.
Well, dear expert, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.